So thanks everybody for attending. So I'll call this meeting of the Governor's Property Tax Advisory Council, the local government subcommittee. So we can do a roll call. Do you want to do that, Ryan?
Yeah, I think Brandy's got the list there. She'll read off roll call for the members present.
Okay. Chair Hertz.
Present.
Vice Chair Galt.
Here.
Tom McGillravy.
Here.
Manish.
Present.
Kendall Cotton.
Here.
Sean Logan.
Here.
Justin Ross.
Here.
DJ Smith.
Here.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody. And then maybe Brandy or who's ever sharing the screen, maybe if you could post up the agenda for today.
Yep. I can share that, Brandy, if you'd like, unless you got it right there.
That'd be great.
Okay. Here, I'm pulling it up. And maybe while I'm pulling up the agenda, Mr. Chairman, is it okay if I maybe address just a couple administrative things while we're waiting here? Great, thank you. I guess first and foremost, thanks again for dedicating your time to some of this. I know it's going to be a series of several meetings. You're already invested 2 in at this point. So, certainly thank you. The other subcommittees have met. Thus far, it seemed like it's been a pretty good process, not too clunky, but bear with us to the extent it is. I guess just a couple of things wanted to let you know. First, I think last week we sent out some templates, hopefully to accompany you through your subcommittee work. Hopefully allow for some consistency, some certain questions, some things to answer when you're making recommendations back to the full subcommittee. It will also help us staff maybe be a little bit more efficient in drafting ultimately your committee's report to the governor, so we can do some cut and paste and some consistent templating. And also, I think we'll make the discussions of the full committee go that much easier too, if people are used to seeing that. So use those as you see fit. Certainly we're not in the solution phase right now, or official solutions or recommendations, or at least not the beginning of the meeting, right? But if you need a matrix to think through on the pertinent questions and what things you really should be asking and recommending, that's the goal and the intent of those templates. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions. In terms of purely administrative, looks like we have a pretty good group, about 30 on there. To the extent that there's full committee members that are in the queue or in the waiting room that want to join, certainly as a panelist, or certainly want to speak at any point, go ahead and raise your hand. That's been the most efficient way just to address that. Realizing that some of you just may want to sit back and listen to, and that's okay. And then certainly with public comment, the same process. Just go ahead and raise your hand for public comment and wanting to speak. Also, if there's any questions, particularly for the task force members, we've been doing these committees as kind of a conversational. So if you have them, feel free to bring them up. If you're really involved in the presentation and you just want to write it down, go ahead and put it in the chat box too, or in the Q&A, preferably. We have staff that's monitoring that as well, so we can make sure that we're getting back to that. But with that said, certainly, Chair Ertz, your committee, your discussion, ready to serve.
Sound good. Well, if you could share that agenda, we can throw that up and get going here. I just want to kind of keep this, an informal working group. So like Ryan said, if you have some questions, feel free to raise your hand. If you can't get that done, unmute yourself and just kind of interrupt. I just want to make sure that we're not talking over each other as we go through here. But this is just kind of agenda to get us going here today. It's not all inclusive. We may be adding some additional items too, but I'll just make some opening remarks here before too long. And then I did share a document mainly just to get the discussion going. We identified some issues at our February 14th meeting, and those were allocated back to the local government committee. So I threw those up on a worksheet and threw up some solutions, just throwing them out there to get discussions going. Those aren't all inclusive. So then we can go through and we can discuss potential solutions. see what we need to request for additional information and some public comment. And then also something I'd like to insert, once we get close to adjourning, we want to identify the items that we want to go forward with. I think we'll probably flush that out here in our meeting today, so that when we report to the committee as a whole next week, our meeting, that we can report to them, here's what we've discussed, and here's what we're going forward with. So with that, I don't know, does anybody have any comments or concerns about the agenda today? All right, so seeing none, so just some opening remarks, just reminding the purpose of this subcommittee is, we've already kind of reviewed the issues and concerns. We're going to talk about possible solutions today to help move those forward, and provide more information as the discussion goes through, with eventually, as we all discussed at the February 14th meeting, that we'll have a written report with suggestions to the governor that the governor would be able to use, and the legislature also will be able to look at and possibly look at drafting bills. So the subcommittees, the education, the tax fairness, and now we're the local governments, those two other subcommittees have met previously, as Ryan has pointed out. If you didn't have a chance to participate in those particular meetings or listen in on them, you can go to the budget website. I don't have, it's budget.mt.gov, but I'm sure Ryan after this meeting can share that link up. And if you do have time before our full meeting next week, you might want to go through and just listen to that. I sat in on those mainly because I wanted to make sure we weren't duplicating efforts between different work groups, and just kind of listening to some of the issues that they talked about. And there was a lot of helpful information there. So, and then as a legislator, of course, I've brought a lot of bills over my previous sessions dealing with property taxes, particularly on the local government issues. I'm not here to push forward my agenda on any of those particular bills. So what I'm hoping to do is that as a work group, that we can come up with some possible solutions that move forward. Although as a legislator, I'll be able to lend my experience, about whether that particular solution has been tried, if it's very difficult to get done, or whatever. So I just kind of want this to be kind of an open meeting as we move forward. So that's really all I have. Vice Chair Galt, do you have anything you want to add?
No, Senator, I don't.
All right, well, thank you. So another thing that I want to bring up too, Ryan, if you could share, or someone, the considerations when evaluating policy options. That was another handout that the other subcommittees are working on. And what we had talked about in the committee of a whole and some of the subcommittee chairs was it'd be nice if we all had, kind of a template when we're looking at possible solutions to evaluate the different solutions we're looking at.
Mr. Chairman, did that come up? I want to make sure.
Yes, it did. Yeah, I can see it. Perfect. So
Gotcha.
When we're looking at possible options, and I mean, obviously we have to consider tax shifts between property owners and tax classes. I mean, obviously, if we don't have any new revenue or no expenditure reductions, if I reduce your taxes by $1, someone else has got to pick that up. So we have to be considerate about that and look forward. Also, shifts between property tax and income tax payers. So that needs to be considered. There's a number of issues out there, and we have different types of circuit breakers, elderly homeowner credit, and some others that have looked at that primarily use income tax dollars. So, and then the tax shift between Montana residents and out-of-state property owners too needs to be considered. The impact, particularly here on this committee, on local government, public school funding, both short and long term. Differential effects on counties across the state. I mean, each county is uniquely different, so the impacts are different. And hopefully I always like to look for long-term type solutions, managing to, where the puck is moving to, not managing what's happened in the past, but as our economy changes, how do we need to make changes to make sure that our property tax system is meeting the needs that we do. And then also, we're not just going to create a solution that likely came about just because an anomaly like the COVID event too. And then as we work through these two, we'll need to identify statutory changes that might be coming from a possible solution. So I think as we progress, if we can just, when we think about things, we need to measure and come back and using this as kind of a measuring tool for us. So with that, before we get into going through the identified issues and problems that we had, along with solutions, there's a couple things I would like to have us go over. And first, there's a couple items today. We're going to talk about the property tax assistance programs to kind of bring us up to date on those, and local government services website too, to kind of review that. So first up on the agenda, let's do the property tax assistance programs and kind of briefly run through those. And can't remember what staffer was going to do those, but feel free to take over.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think it's going to be Bryce Katz, who, let's make sure that he's in. Bryce, are you in? I just want to make sure that he's in the process of getting admitted right now. I just saw his hand got raised, so we're bringing him in right now, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman,
Sure.
in this lull, Megan Moore reminded me that the issue of TIFs have come up several times in the other subcommittees, and they would be able to do a presentation on TIFs at a different meeting.
Okay, yeah, that'd be very helpful. All right, we can see that, Bryce. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. My name is Bryce Katz. I'm a Bureau Chief with the Property Assessment Division. I'm just going to kind of high level walk through some of the property tax assistance programs that are available currently, how they operate, so you have a kind of better understanding of those. So the first program is our property tax assistance program. That's the general high level program, commonly referred to as PTAP. The requirements for this particular program is you have to own the property, and similar to what you might have heard with the property tax rebate, you have to hold it in either your individual name or in a revocable trust. Property held in, say, an LLC or irrevocable trust does not meet that ownership criteria. The second criteria you have to meet to qualify for the PTAP program is you have to occupy the property as your primary residence for at least 7 months of the year. And then the last one is your qualifying income needs to fall within the limits that are listed on this slide. I will point out the definition for qualifying income is your federal adjusted gross income excluding losses. So there are some sources of income that are non-taxable and don't count towards your federal adjusted gross income. Your primary example you see in this program would be Social Security. So if you're say a couple and your only income is from Social Security, that's going to primarily pretty much be all non-taxable. So if you say had as a couple $30,000 a year in Social Security benefits, for the purposes of that program, that would be a zero federal adjusted gross income, and you would qualify for the 80% reduction. So there's 3 tiers. You can see those income brackets below based on whether you're a single person or a married or filing head of household. You can either qualify for an 80%, 50%, or 30% reduction. And that's on the tax rate that gets applied to the market value of your property. Starting in 2024, for this property tax assistance program, that is capped at $350,000. That is an increase for the 2024 tax year over what it has been prior, which was a $200,000 cap. So this benefit would get applied up to the first $350,000 of market value for that property. A change made in the past session is that amount will now adjust each reappraisal cycle based on the median value of the properties that are enrolled in the property tax assistance program. So that $200,000 was in place for a number of years before it increased to 350,000 for 2024. And that will increase or potentially, I guess, decrease each reappraisal cycle moving forward based on what the value of a property is. In the same manner, the income thresholds listed below, again, will be adjusted each year with an inflationary adjustment based on the PCE. And a change to that was made during the 2021 session. If that calculation results in those income thresholds decreasing at all, they're frozen at what they were the prior year. The other thing I'll just kind of point out, as far as this program is concerned and that $350,000 cap, is this only applies to ad valorem property taxes, which is the taxes that are based off of the mills applied to the taxable value. So any special fees and assessments that are in addition on someone's tax bill to those ad valorem general property taxes do not get included with this benefit. The second program that we have available is very similar with a few differences. It's the Montana Disabled Veterans Property Tax Assistance, or MDV. Has the same three requirements that you have to own the property, you have to occupy the property for at least 7 months of primary residence, and you have to fall within the income criteria shown at the bottom of the slide. There's an additional requirement for this to be eligible for this program, and that's that you either have to be rated at 100% disabled from the VA or paid at the 100% disabled rate, or you have to be the surviving spouse of someone who was rated or paid at the 100% rate at the time of their passing, passed as the result of a service-connected disability or passed while on active duty. Again, same definition of qualifying income for this program, your federal adjusted gross income excluding losses. So again, a key consideration here is those VA disability benefits are not taxable. So that would show up as a zero value or zero income as far as meeting the criteria for this particular program. This one does have a higher percentage that you can qualify for. You can either qualify for 100%, 80%, 70%, or 50% reduction based on where your income falls. And unlike the property tax assistance program, there is no market value cap on this program. So it would qualify for the entire value of your property. So if your property is valued at $1 million and you qualify for the 100% reduction, you would pay zero ad valorem property taxes. But it has the same caveat as the PTAP program, as it does not apply to any special fees or assessments that are in addition to the ad valorem mill-based property tax. This information is available in our biennial report. It just kind of shows the last 15, 16 years of data, the number of participants in the property tax assistance program, the overall reduction in taxable value. Touch briefly on the last couple columns. So the loss in state revenue is assuming that the 95 mills, the 6 university mills, and the 1.5 VOTEC mills are held constant. So a decrease in taxable value in relation to those mills being held constant is a loss in revenue to the state general fund for those school equalization mills. Also, people receiving this benefit results in a tax shift to the local properties in that taxing jurisdiction. So I'm sure you'll cover some of the mechanisms of 1510-420. Essentially, when you're lowering the overall total taxable value a taxing jurisdiction has, it results in an increased mills over what they would have otherwise levied, which results in a tax shift to all of the other taxpayers in that taxing jurisdiction that aren't receiving that benefit. And then the last couple columns are just the total amount of both that loss in state revenue and the tax shift, and then what the average taxpayer enrolled in that program is receiving in essentially a lower property tax bill. So for 2022, the average enrollee in the PTAP program saw their property tax bill lowered by $843. Those are the two main programs available. There are a couple of other ones I'll touch on briefly. Here, we'll just you can see that same information is available for the Montana Disabled Veterans Program. If you're curious of what that's looked like over time.
Bryce, can I interrupt you 1 second?
Yep.
Counselor Vaseka needs to be added back, promoted again to a panelist. Brandy or Ryan. Thank you.
Go ahead, Bryce.
Okay, the other couple programs that are out there is an intangible land value property tax exemption. This is a little unique and harder to qualify. It's for up to 5 acres of land. That land has to be valued disproportionately high to the primary residence on the property. So that land has to be in value in excess of 150% of what the residential improvements are. It has the same general requirements as the other one. You have to own the property. It has to be used as your primary residence. The other additional requirement to qualify for this program is it has to have been owned in your family for at least 30 years within the 3rd degree of consanguinity, which is just lineage. And then the other one that doesn't actually impact your property tax bill, but is an income tax credit that's available to offset what you pay in property taxes, is the elderly homeowner and renter credit. See there, credit up to $1,150. You have to be 62 years or older in order to claim that credit. The other unique thing with this credit is it is available to renters, whereas the other 3 programs, you have to own the property. And then this one has a little higher residency requirement of 9 months versus 7 months for the other programs. I will mention that it is possible to receive both the elderly homeowner renter credit and be enrolled in either the PTAP or MVV programs. The elderly homeowner renter credit, there's a formula that determines how much of the credit you're eligible for based on what you paid in property tax and what your income is. So you can receive both PTAP and be eligible to claim the elderly homeowner renter credit. It just might reduce the level of credit you'd be eligible for because you're not paying as much property tax as you otherwise would have. Where this really comes into play are some of the higher value areas in the state, say Gallatin County, where the median value of a home is up there over $800,000, with that cap of formerly $200,000 in market value and now $350,000. Those people are still paying a pretty substantial amount of property tax, which means they'd still be eligible for potentially the maximum 2EC credit. I see some hands up, so I can answer questions if you have them now.
Looks like Senator McGilvery has a question.
Yeah, Bryce, just curious if Social Security qualifies as income for the disabled veteran program.
So there is a formula that is part of the Form 2 that you fill out that based on what you received in Social Security and what other sources of income you have and how much income you received. There's a worksheet you go through that tells you how much, if any, of your Social Security is taxable. So I think generally if you have veteran benefits, depending on where those are, your Social Security probably isn't going to be taxable, or at least not fully taxable. But there is a worksheet, and it is based on what other sources of income you have and how much of that income.
All right, any other questions? Sandra, you have your hand up there. You have a question?
Yeah, so I was wondering why for the PTAP program, why do we require only 7 months out of the year to reside in Montana? I mean, if people are applying for property tax reduction issues, then shouldn't they have to reside in Montana 12 months out of the year if they're really that desperate for help? I guess that's my line of thinking regarding that.
So that's an option that we can look at. The 7 months out of the year, Bryce, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's a standard that's used for numerous issues across the state when it comes to whether you're a resident or not. Am I correct on that, Bryce?
Yeah, I mean, again, you're correct. It's a policy decision that could be looked at and evaluated. I think you'll see that a lot to kind of maybe alleviate equalization concerns with treating non-residents and residents differently. There's those provisions in the US Constitution. So I think that's kind of one way, if you don't declare it only eligible to a resident, but put that residency require as a number of months, I think it kind of helps alleviate some of those concerns.
Yeah, and I think if you look at what Hawaii does, it has a significant reduction for residents. Their requirements there are 6 months and 1 day. So I think that probably is kind of what we're looking at there. So Sean, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. So any idea of the participation rate or, of those in Montana that are eligible, how many are availing themselves? Do you have any sense of that?
We don't have a great sense of that. We've tried looking at that in the past. The real issue is our income tax system and property tax system are two very different systems, and they don't really communicate greatly with each other. So it's hard for us to get a good, accurate measure of what that utilization or participation rate is. I know that I think we're going to be trying to look at something. We kind of have a unique opportunity, I would say, with the property tax rebate, where we now do have some information that we can kind of look into that. And I think we're planning on doing that. But unfortunately, I don't have a good way of currently determining what that participation rate is among eligible property owners.
Thank you.
So yeah, thanks for the question, Sean. And so the purpose of this analysis is kind of bring us all up to speed on what these are, because that'll be part of our discussion too as we move forward. How do we make sure that people in Montana are aware of these assistance programs? What other alternatives might we use to make them aware of it? So that's something that we can flesh out here later as we get later into the day. So.
And I can speak briefly to some of the things we do. There is the requirement that we mention all of the property tax assistance programs on the assessment notices that get mailed to every taxpayer every other year for our reappraisal. So it is required in law that we mention those property tax assistance programs on the assessment notice. I believe it's also a requirement that those programs are listed on the tax bills themselves. Now we do periodic Facebook, social media outreach. We work with organizations and reach out to organizations such as AARP. We do radio broadcasts. We hang flyers. So there is outreach. Again, it's just hard to do specific targeted outreach because we don't have a great way of matching property owners with what their actual is.
So now that we did do the property tax rebates, that gives you probably another database that you might possibly be able to use going forward.
Yeah, I think we're going to explore it. We do have a unique opportunity over this year and next year with those rebates where we have people telling us that they are a primary residence owner and the specific property that they reside in. So we do have an opportunity, I think, to try to do a little additional cross-matching and see what that might be and do some targeted outreach to people that we think might qualify.
Okay. Dwayne, you have a question?
Yeah, one question I had is these reductions that we have for the veterans and for the PTAP, does the state reimburse the county for those reductions, or the county just shifts that tax to everybody else?
No, those
Correct.
taxes are just shifted. Yes. Yeah. Sandra, you have another question, comment, or is your hand still?
Yeah, no, correct me if I'm out of line, but I'm a little bit frustrated about the I guess with the property tax assistance programs. Yes, I'm happy that they're available, but doesn't that mean that we're failing as a government because our property taxes are too high that we have to have these assistance programs because we're recognizing that we are doing a bad job as stewards of the tax dollars? I guess I just wanted to get that out there.
Yeah. All right. Appreciate the comment. Any other questions, comments? Justin?
Question on this for the elderly tax credit. The maximum income limit of 45,000, does that mean that you can't apply if your income is over 45,000? So like if you earn the 45,000 in first dollar, then you have to pay the full bill?
Correct. There's a formula that, again, based on where your income falls and what you paid in property taxes, determines how much of that credit you're eligible to receive, but the upper threshold is at $45,000. So if you're over that $45,000, you're not eligible to receive any of the credit.
Okay, so it's not graduated and no. Okay.
There is a phase out of the credit. It's not just a benefits cliff where that next dollar takes you from getting a large amount of credit to nothing. It phases out between, I think, 35,000, 45,000. So
Oh, I see. Okay.
So yeah, this is helpful. Thanks a lot, Bryce. And all of these programs are something that we can evaluate, and do we want to make some changes to them, whether it's income levels, property levels, eligibility. So it's just something that allows us, we got existing programs that we can continue to look at. The intangible land value exemption, it's confusing to some, but I guess if you think of, this came about in the 2017 session, that if you have some acreage, you have maybe a family cabin that's been on typically a river or lake in Montana, pretty modest cabin, might be worth a couple $100,000, 300, but the neighbor all of a sudden bought a similar property next to you and paid $8 million for a chunk of land. So that's what that was trying to alleviate, that if you have a $200,000 house, that your land can't exceed 150% of the improvements. So it helps out those family circumstances, but it's something that we can continue to look at. I think it's probably expanded out more too, with other than just on lakes and rivers, to other recreational type property now too, where people can qualify for that. So all right, any other questions or comments about the property tax assistance programs? All right, so seeing none, so Ryan, let's move on to, you had somebody who was kind of going to give us a briefing of local government services website and how that is used by local governments and who administers that program at the state, et cetera.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Mr. Chair, I'll let Cheryl and Daniil introduce themselves to you, but I think they've been promoted as a panelist, but I'd go ahead and ask them to share their screen, just a little bit of a context. I think some of you may have met Cheryl last meeting. She is one of the official staffers for this committee. She oversees the Local Government Services Bureau. Thought it might just be helpful more than anything, just to kind of take you a tour through their website, nothing more, nothing less, but maybe if you were a local government, a county, a city, what would your experience, or what would you first see? What are the expectations? Basically, what does that portal look like? So with that said, I invite them to go ahead and share screen at their convenience.
Are they on?
Yeah, we're on.
Them on the
Yeah,
list.
they're on.
Sorry.
Hi, this is Cheryl Gray. I'm the administrator of the State Financial Services Division, and one of our bureaus is the Local Government Services Bureau. And Daniil Vincent heads up that shop, and she is here to do an overview of our website. So our bureau collects all the audits, annual financial reports, and budgets where it's required from the local governments. We have a transparency site. We have lots of training resources. So Daniil's going to go through our website, and we're happy to answer any questions at the end of that. So, or as we're going through it.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I am Daniil Vincent. Can you just let me know that you can see my screen? I'm sharing our website here with you. Can you see that?
Yes, we can. It's working. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. So where I'm at right now is the State Financial Services Division main website page. As Cheryl mentioned, my bureau is under the State Financial Services Division. And how you find us, if you're out there looking on the State Financial Services Division, is there's this tile here on the website called the Local Government Financial Reporting and Audit Resources. So if you click there, that's going to take you into lots of helpful information as it pertains to the local governments that we serve and what we do. And I'm just going to give you kind of a brief walkthrough of things to just, in case you're not familiar and you're wondering what we have out there, I'm just going to kind of give you a little quick tour, if you will. So as Cheryl mentioned, we collect the statutorily required reports from our local governments, and that would be the accounting, that would be our annual financial reports, which all local governments are required to submit to the Department of Administration, to my bureau, annually. And then we also collect audit and financial review reports. There are thresholds and requirements as to when an audit would be required from a local government. And then we also collect the budget resources, the budgets from our cities, counties, and towns. And so how they submit is we do have a portal that they go out to. We're getting a brand new portal here pretty soon. We've been working on a software conversion that will provide our users with what we believe and hope to be a very enhanced, more user-friendly experience when they're out on the portal, and in terms of looking at reports and also submitting reports to us. But just as a quick first view, I want to show you where, and like I said, we have lots of helpful links kind of along the side, and then helpful links built within each of these tabs. Like very quickly, I'll just touch on school district links. Like we try to, work with OPI to make sure that we have similar information, lots of stuff about school districts, lots of helpful links, forms, templates, instructions, links to other places where someone might need to get that ties into some of these other groups. And so each of these tabs has, like here's the annual financial report resources. Here are all the templates. They're an Excel version that the county, cities, and towns can use to prepare their reports to submit them to us. There's special purpose districts. So there's lots of helpful. There's, calculation forms, year-end procedure checklists to help them with the closing of their year. The BAR's chart of accounts which is what the guidelines of the accounting system that the local government should use. Lots of stuff. I don't want to get too deep. I could probably spend lots more than my allotted time showing, but I just want to give you a quick picture. And then of course, similar audit and financial reviews. We have instructions for the auditors. We have sample documents, all kinds of things. There's actually, how does a local government find an auditor? We have the audit roster, which is those approved auditors to work with local governments. We publish that once a year, and as auditors apply to be on the roster, we put them out there so local governments can find them and see them. Let's see, I hope I don't lose. Oh shoot, I'm so sorry, I lost us. Dang it. All right, hold on, I'm gonna get us back there. My apologies, I hit the wrong button.
No problem. I think we've all been there.
Oh, Lord. It's hard because the bar for the Zoom sharing is right across the top of my screen. And so I couldn't quite get to the right X. But you know what? This is a good exercise to show you that if you lose your way, how do you get back, right? And here's how we get back. We're right back in there. We're going to go back into the local government services. And let's see, where was I? So I was showing you audit stuff, the audit roster. Here's our budget resources tab. Before I go into that, I just want to quickly show you where can the public look for information about our local governments. And that would be in our public portal link. And we have this view local government reports online once you get into there. And then we're here. And like I said, our new portal is so much more beautiful than this. I can't wait to show it to you. But this is what we have right now, and we click on this. And so you want to say, hey, has, you know, the city of Hamilton or the county of Missoula submitted a document, and you want to look to see if it's out there. So let's say we're looking for a budget. So we're going to click budgets. Everything that's been submitted to the Local Government Services Bureau has, you know, gets put out on the website. This is part of our transparency that we do. And so you can search by, you know, if you're interested in looking for a particular county, city or town, because we're in the budgets area, but you can search and find it easier. So here you can see, here are some City of Missoula budgets that have been submitted for the fiscal years of 22, 23, and 24. They're out there published for someone to look at. You can literally click on the document. It'll take you into just some brief information, and then it takes a sec to load. But then here is the actual document that you can open, and oh gosh, I hope I don't like lose this by clicking the wrong button again. But this would open then into the actual document. You can download it. Would you like me to do that? I'm afraid I'm going to bump us out, but I can certainly try.
Sure, why don't you give it a shot?
All right, let's give it a shot and hope that I hit the right button here. So this is literally the document that's been received. And then the public can see that, you know, and these usually have links that will take us into other places within the document. Very useful information. So again, any budget that's been submitted to us, I think our website goes back to 2014, I want to say, for budgets. We have about 10 years worth of data out there, the whole document that's submitted to us. Oh goodness, help me here. Let's see, how am I going to get rid of this guy? I don't want to click that one.
You go to the tab. Yes, sir.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you, Cheryl. All right, so let's get back in there, back into the local governments. You can also look at any of the annual financial reports. There are reports that the public might want to know about, hey, who hasn't submitted a budget on time? And I'm focusing a little bit on budgets because I know we're talking about, you know, the taxes and things that make up the funds of the organizations, governments. But let's look at like this delinquent budget report. And that again is a download. This is budgets that have not been submitted by the time. So it lists them alphabetically by the entity name and then fiscal year within the alphabetizing scheme of things. So budgets are due to the Local Government Services Bureau by October 1st of every year. This last year, there was an extension that was provided where budgets weren't due till the 16th of October. And so this just shows when the budget was due. And so if they're on this list, obviously it's past that date, at least usually 60 days past that date. And this is showing who has not submitted a budget. And we have that similar report I apologize for the bouncing around. Again, it's hard to see with the screens, but these reports list all sorts of things. So there's also, you know, who's delinquent on their annual financial reports, what's delinquent on the audit reports, that sort of thing. So we've been to the budget. So that is the public portal where you can see all kinds of stuff. And then if we go back a click, let's go to, I'm going to take us back to the main page, and I want to take you into a couple of other places, and then we'll probably be out of time and have some time for questions. But there is the budget resources tab here. And this is where, you know, our cities, counties, and towns will go and look at, and here's where we talked about, you know, when our budget's due, when is it due, what MCA, what statute drives the budget. And in this period, we have a note that talks about the extension that was applied for the fiscal year 24 period, when typically budgets were due October 1st. And then these are helpful resources for the local governments if they want to use our template to prepare their budget. They can also submit their budget in their own system on their own forms, as long as it contains all the same information we would need if they used our same Excel template. And I'll just click on this really quick. It's a pretty big document. So it's, you know, it's helpful. It has the tabs for the local governments to use. And of course, so we, you know, part of the requirements is we need your resolution. So it's just kind of a helpful, walks them through if they want to use our template again. And then it gets kind of into the meat of things in terms of, there's lots of tabs. So if you have questions, I'm going to come back to that. I'm just going to minimize that one. So this is helpful to them. Another thing that I'd like to show you is this training resources tab. And this is where we have lots of other stuff. And again, so these are mostly PowerPoint type handouts and trainings that we've either done or that we've put together. One of our goals for this next year is to start re-recording. Pre-COVID, we had some recorded sessions out there, and we want to start doing that again because that's helpful to put out for folks to view. But under the budget category, we have several handouts you can see here where it's like, well, why do we budget? What is the Local Government Budget Act? Forms and submissions. And in this one here, this forms and submissions one, I think it's on page 10. So I'll just kind of quickly, this is training that we've done previously. I want to say that some of it needs to be updated a little bit. For the most part, it's, you know, it's still there. This again is talking about what do you need to submit to us and what forms do you need to use. I think it's on page 10. This is a really helpful calculator that just gives you kind of the flow about what's supposed to happen when and who's supposed to do what. And this comes straight out of MCA, the Local Budget Act. So that's Title 7, Chapter 6, Part 40. And so this is a nice, helpful flow chart, if you will. Let's see if we go back a step. There's also you know, so they're all lots of these pieces, but this is one, you know, why do we budget? Why do we need to budget? What's involved? Who says we have to do it? What do we turn in? So lots of different, I think, what do we say? There's 4 different, 1, 2, 3, 4, all have lots of great information. And, you know, always, of course, they can contact us. We have a team of 5 folks who can help answer questions with budgeting and if they have troubles getting them to us, submitting them to us, that sort of thing. So I think that kind of covers it. I want to leave a little bit of time in case you have any questions. If you want me to show you anything else, I'd be happy to do that.
No, that looks good. Let's move on. Looks like
Okay.
Ralph, do you have a question? You got your hand up there or a comment?
Yes. Danielle, can you remind everyone how many jurisdictions have to submit these reports? It's you guys receive a lot of reports from a lot of jurisdictions.
We do, yeah.
People need to
So,
understand that.
right, thank you, Ralph. So there are 56 counties and there are 128 cities and towns. So I guess I got to add those together in my brain, but you know, about 180 reports that we get on an annual basis.
For budgets.
For budgets only. Yeah, so for annual financial reports, there are 1,332 local governments, and we get all of their reports with the exception of the school districts. Theirs go to the Office of Public Instruction. Their actual physical reports go there, but there's 1,300 of those. Audits average about 440 a year that we review fully and completely.
Sandra, you have a question, comment?
Yeah, I just want to quickly say thank you very much for showing this and for using Mozilla as an example, because I have never seen that document that you pulled up. As a city councilor, I should have access to the full budget. However, I only get the budget in review or a quick budget or anything like that, but I've never actually seen that actual document. So I'm going to be taking a very good reading tour over that. So thank you so much for showing that to me.
Yeah, I'm very glad it was helpful to you. You're welcome.
So obviously there's filing deadlines for them to provide this information. Are there penalties if they don't meet those filing deadlines?
So there are really no penalties for budgets not being met within a certain timeline. There are definitely penalties of different types, both monetary and publication penalties as it pertains to not filing their annual financial reports or their required audit reports. Budgets, we just basically let the public know that the budget hasn't been turned in, but there are no real penalties around that other than that currently.
All right. Does anybody else have any comments or questions before Senator McGilvery?
Yeah, just a quick question. What's the most delinquent budget you have out there? Don't necessarily need a city or town, but how many are like a year past due or 2 years past due?
Let's put a tab open. To answer that, Senator, I'm gonna need to open that report really quick because I have so many numbers and entities in my head there. But let's just take a quick peek. Let's practice again here. So we're gonna go out to the public portal. We're gonna do the reports, and I would really encourage you to look around and see if there's interesting things out there for you. But then we're gonna go to this delinquent budget report, and I'm gonna open it up. And again, this is alphabetical, so we got to kind of scan down, but it looks like we have some outstanding budgets from 2014 and 15. Quite a few actually. So those would be our oldest ones, because that's as far back as we go in terms of what we have to access through the portal to look at is 2014. So thankfully we don't have a ton. Oh, I'm sorry, I lied. Here's a 2012, 13, 14. Those are pretty old, yeah. But I would say
They submitted budgets for 16, 17, 18, and so forth?
yes, yeah, if they've been submitted, they're not on this list. That's correct, yes.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
All right, any other questions, comments? All right, thank you very much. That was very helpful. Gives us a little bit of idea what local governments have to work with and what they might go through. So moving on to the main topic today is basically looking at issues and problems we've identified at the past meeting, and then getting into some discussion about possible solutions and whether we want to continue to look at some of these or not. So Ryan, if you could kind of share that spreadsheet that I had provided, we'll take a look at it. It's kind of small. I don't know if you can enlarge it a little bit and maybe get rid of some of the
junk around it. Yeah, let me see here.
So this was emailed out to everybody. Sorry for the size. I mean, it's not too bad. I got my laptop so I can see it, but there you go. That's better. So we can these are some of the on the left-hand column is identified issues that were kind of divvied up between the different three subcommittees, and these are the ones that were sent our way. The first one, and these aren't in any particular order. I did group some of them together because they kind of seem to overlap. And the right column was just kind of a suggestion out there to maybe get the conversation going. So the first one has to do with geographic discrepancies, unique and diverse localities. And I guess kind of maybe what that means to me is how different counties are across the state, east, west, et cetera, and what can really make a difference whether you might be in a particular, locality that might have, let's say, a lot of centrally assessed properties, pipelines, et cetera, that are taxed at a much higher rate than even commercial or residential. There may be also non-levy revenue, which is sitting in that particular locality, which they get to use then for to offset their property taxes. So I know, sitting through the school subcommittee, and we've kind of addressed that with schools where we have a base budget and a maximum budget, and we use the 95 mills to equalize. but we've never really had something in the general overall property taxes for local governments to, I guess, for not a better word, to equalize it across the state. So I don't know if, one of the thoughts I had is, number one, first we need to probably identify those, what are the non-levy revenues out there? And some of those are federal revenues that come into a particular county or area. They might have some metal mines and some other things like that. But maybe if we can identify those at a statewide level and see what the dollar amount of those are, across the state, and then maybe looking at other states too, and how do they deal with some of these unique circumstances. So with that, I'll kind of open it up for any comment or suggestions that people might have. Just raise your hand or unmute and jump on in. All right, well, I really don't see any comments. So does anybody think, is that something we need to look at? Senator McGilver, you got your hand up there.
Yeah, I'm just looking at this, look at non-levy revenues and revenues from high value properties. So what specifically are we talking about here? High value properties that may not have revenues? Talking about nonprofits or something like that, or where are you going with that?
No, what I look at more of the high value properties are things like obviously the Yellowstone Club and those high value, market value properties that really help reduce local property taxes within that particular taxing jurisdiction. And just a matter of, and this probably meets more in the fairness subcommittee, is that really that's that a fairness issue and how it relates to taxpayers across the state.
Mr. Chair, can
Sure.
you give an example or two of non-levy revenue?
So sure, I mentioned one was had to do with federal forest receipts, and I think another might be the metal mines tax. Ralph or Ryan, do you guys have any other examples out there on non-levy revenue?
Full gross proceeds in districts with coal mines, and natural oil and gas revenue is probably the biggest source of non-levy revenue.
Okay, thank you. That helps clarify that for me. Thanks.
So I think in the past, we've left those, some of those revenues come to the state, a portion of them go to the local government, mainly to offset, issues they might have. If you have a coal mine or oil and gas or something in your locality, that you may need some additional revenue to help, to mitigate some of the issues that come along with that. So, to me, I think one of the things that we should maybe get going forward are those, what are the non-levy revenues across the state? How much total is there out there? How much goes to state? How much goes to local government? So Justin, you have a comment?
Is it okay? It's on something non-levy related?
Sure. Yep. Yep.
In looking at the different property tax relief policies that they have, I think one of the challenges is that they mentioned is that because there's means testing involved, a challenge is the fact that the income tax system and the property tax systems don't communicate with each other well. So to take the elderly tax credit example, I assume that the problems in principle is that people, at the time the property tax bills are being administered, they don't know their AGI or their most recent AGI. So two ideas come to mind. One could be that if we want people to get a better sense of what their property tax bill comes, is that they see on their property tax bill the income tax credit that they are eligible for applied to their property tax bill. So it's just down right off the bat, as opposed to getting reimbursed, 12 months, a year later, whatever. So either looking for ways to make the systems better able to communicate with each other, or swapping them all together for ones that don't rely on this. So like a $45,000 limit for max limit on incomes for elderly is probably a fairly large percentage of households that are only relying on Social Security. So maybe if we considered just dropping the means tested version of it and just implementing something like if this property is designated to be eligible for an elderly tax credit, that they'll just see it taken right off of their property tax bill, and the local government would essentially just be billing the state for 15% of their tax bill or something like that, and then paying for that by dropping the income tax credit. If that makes sense. So like swapping it out from one system to the other, so taken as a given that they can't communicate very effectively to each other.
Sure. So yeah, I didn't want to cut you off there. We will circle back around to review the property tax assistance programs, and so we'll discuss those a little bit later too. But thanks for that input. And that brought me up to another question. Ralph or Ryan, are one of you going to kind of keep notes here? I'm writing the notes down too as people make comments on different things. So just wanted to double check on that. Who's kind of the subcommittee secretary here?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, it's kind of a collective effort, but I think the answer is yes, probably redundant. Yes.
Okay. All right.
Plus,
Dwayne, do you have a comment or?
Yeah, one thing I've always wondered is why the non-levy revenue and the entitlement share isn't subtracted from the budget before you calculate the mill levy. You know, when you go back in time 20 years ago, the oil and gas revenues to a county was treated as though it was mill money and distributed per what the mills would have been through the different areas. And once you did the big bill, what was back in 2005, whatever, that's come through an entitlement share, and the counties end up with that as extra money. The gaming taxes go through that and stuff. And it seems to me that revenue should come off the budget first, and then you divide by the taxable value to get the mill levy.
Good comment. I guess that's another thing we can look at. So thanks. Dylan, do you have a comment there?
Yeah, I'll just respond to that. So the entitlement share, people or legislators should be familiar with the reductions in 1510-420 as a result of the Class 8 reimbursements. So the entitlement share has actually already been subtracted out of local government's budgets. It just happens one time. They lose that budget authority one time, and then of course that lost budget authority is compounding over time because they're not getting their inflation factor, they're not getting the newly taxable amount applied to that. So I believe it's not true to say that the local governments are getting extra money as a result of the entitlement share. I think it just, the subtractions happened in the past and they've been compounded forward.
But as the entitlement share grows, is that growth adjusted at all?
No, that is true that the entitlement share is growing separately from their ad valorem revenue. So that is true, sir. It's a good point.
Any other comments on this particular topic?
I guess I'll also comment, since I turned my camera on already, that there is kind of an odd distinction between metal mines and miscellaneous mines and true non-levy revenue like oil, gas, and coal. Class 1 and Class 2 property are still within the property tax system and pay taxes based on mills, whereas oil and gas and coal have statutory fixed rates on their gross value. So 1510-420 subtracts out the value of Class 1 and 2 property for governments to determine their mills and then applies the mills to that property. Essentially what it does is it forces the local government to be agnostic of the value that is coming out of the mine, but it's still a mill-based system for Class 1 and Class 2 property, whereas oil, gas, and coal are flat percentage taxes.
Dylan?
So, Dylan, the entitlement share was subtracted at one time out of their base budget, but the non-levy revenue, is anything done with that in regard to their budgeting?
I am not familiar enough to answer confidently about that.
Mr.
All right, so I think we
Chairman,
flushed out some stuff there and we can circle back around it towards the end. It's probably something that just might need a little bit more information as we go down that road. So seeing no more comments, we'll move on to the second item here, a need to increase voter education on ballots. I'm not sure exactly what that might mean. I don't know, Ryan or Ralph, from our larger meeting, do you recall maybe what direction what that might be about?
Mr. Chairman, I think that that's one that probably appeared on most subcommittees. It's really up to you how much you do or don't want to discuss it. Obviously, this list was exhaustive. It wasn't necessarily the recommended list. I guess
Okay,
what I can say on that was, I think, recognizing that kind of a top down from voter education, taxpayer education from the state agencies, all the way to voter education at the locals and school districts. I think it was that sentiment, but certainly if there's anything on, education that could be an improvement, it's certainly within your discretion. I will say that the education subcommittee led by legislator or Representative Beatty, they are looking at school elections and dates and those types of things too. And so that would definitely fall under the auspices of voter education, I suppose. But that's all that point was.
okay. Yeah, I think from the standpoint of mill levies, et cetera, especially bond levies right now, what's on the ballot tells individuals about, how much their taxes may increase if they approve this particular bond levy. Voter pamphlets have some pretty good information on that too. So, other than maybe moving dates around, which the education subcommittee is looking at, I don't know. So, Kendall, you have your hand up there. What do you got?
Yeah, I think that it would be a good idea for us to also look at election dates. I think that, part of our goal here should hopefully be to help make property taxes a little more democratic. And I think that, shifting the votes on, levies and bonds and things like that to be voted on, when most voters are actually at the ballot box, which would be general elections, I think would be a good way to make sure that the most amount of people possible are informing themselves and actually weighing in on a proposal for increased taxes.
Yeah, and that came up at the education subcommittee too. And just to be the devil's advocate on that a little bit is most of our, if not all our school and local elections are mail ballot right now. So it's kind of a little bit about voter apathy. Why aren't you returning your ballot? And would it make any difference if you got a mail ballot on the primary date or the general election date? So there's things to look at. But I think looking at what other states do, because I know a lot of states do push their some of their local elections in those to more of a general election date and kind of see how they're doing would be helpful. So Sandra, do you have a comment?
One thing that we can look at regarding voter education that I've seen, at least on Missoula County property tax bills, for the levies that are voted, it says parenthesis voted levy and parenthesis. And then another thing that I really liked with the recent fire levy that we're going to put on the ballot, at the end of the ask on the ballot is going to say an increase in property taxes may lead to an increase in rental costs. So maybe a requirement of having something like that on any voted levies might do something, I guess.
Yeah, that's all good ideas. And another thing that just brought me up thinking about that too is TIFs. I was trying to work into how do you educate a voter that, okay, I'm going to vote for this. Take the example of the $7 million levy in Missoula. How much of that is going to end up in a TIF, and how much the amount that's diverted to a TIF, what is that going to raise your taxes as a local taxpayer? Because a portion of that is going to end up in a TIF. So I think just education like that, that's another topic down the road a little bit is, or TIFs though too, so. Any other comments?
Yeah, I could talk about TIFs all day.
Yeah.
And Mr. Chairman and Representative, maybe now's a good time. We've heard that comment, I guess, in some of the other subcommittees too. And so I think one of the agenda topics that we'll likely be considering potentially as part of the full committee is exactly that, an informational session on TIFs. We know that there's Megan Moore with the legislative branch has done presentations in the past. We also have resources with some of our public finance partners that can do a pretty good job on that too. And so we'll be discussing with Director Osmondson, because it does have it's maybe more in one person's area, but it touches everybody's, right? So we're looking at for a future agenda topic.
Okay. All right, so need for increased voter education. Looks like we'll leave that up there. We got some election dates, tax increases, etc. So just maybe a little more voter information out there when you're voting on a particular levy or issue. The next item is out-of-state homeowners, lesser demand on local services. And I think that was brought up to the fact about shifting taxes to non-residents, and how maybe we need to be considerate and be careful about that, because quite frankly, in a lot of the non-residents, like the Yellowstone Club, and those of us who had a tour up there, a lot of those folks are only there for 2 or 3 weeks out of the year. They put very little stress on local services. Even up here in other areas, like in the Flathead area too, a lot of people are only at their second homes for a month or less, or a couple months. So are they really putting a pressure on local services, or are they actually helping local taxpayers and reducing their taxes due to the amount of taxes that they're paying? So I guess that's what that particularly means. I'm not sure if that leads into a solution or something that we need to comment on, and just keep that thought out there. Any thoughts? DJ?
Yeah, just on that topic, I thought, I believe it was the shifting subcommittee had a really good slide just illustrating that though that population is 10% of all, or I guess they looked at the mailing addresses of the tax bills, and out of that data set, 10% were out of state, but they contributed to 20% of the taxable revenue, which was an interesting stat when we're talking about how much they contribute to our overall tax piece. So if we have that discussion, it would be helpful to have that data set in the future.
Yeah, and the Tax Fairness Committee is looking at that. And I think those numbers might have been closer to 15% have out-of-state residents addresses, which we really don't know, but their share of the taxable value is 20% and growing at a pace of about 1% a year. So that's very interesting. Who else has got their Manish? Is that how you say your first name, Manish?
Yes, sir. That's correct. Yeah. Thank you,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to sort of plus on what DJ said. I saw that statistic as well. And, when we typically talk about property taxes, we say, well, they're both transparent and they correspond, albeit imperfectly, with sort of the value the service is received. And admittedly, second homeowners are probably, or third homeowners are not going to avail themselves of the entirety of the services locally, but certainly some. And putting an additional strain on their home ownership might yield some outcomes that the state would find detrimental, particularly in an erosion of the base if they were to leave.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. And I think some of the other discussions that came up on that Fairness Committee as well, we could do it. They don't pay income taxes in Montana, or we don't have a sales tax either, so they're not contributing via sales tax. So, an increased tax on there's a lot of ways that you can justify, either way as to where we need to head with that. So. All right, any other comments, questions? All right. Seeing none, let's
Mr.
yeah.
Mr. Chairman, sorry.
Go ahead.
Cindy Johnson just made a message. She might actually still be in Puerto Rico or something. She made a comment here about how unoccupied houses still need fire and public safety services. So it isn't a purely zero, but
that is correct. Yeah. Thank you for that comment. All right, so let's move on. The next one, there is an increased demand for local service commensurate with population growth. And then also a comment about, in regard to that, predictability of revenues for local government. So obviously, yeah, there is, as your population grows, there is a demand for local services. So, and then the predictability of as your revenue increasing with the demand side of it there. So I don't know, does anybody have any comments on that particular items? solutions there? Thoughts? I know the Fairness Committee was probably looking at this a little bit on the predictability of revenues, maybe, or other sources of revenue. They talked about local option sales tax. And further on down the agenda, I know Kendall's organization has talked a lot about population and inflation growth. And also, we looked at Senate Bill 511, which we'll discuss at some point in time too, as another way of tackling that particular issue. So Manish, you have a comment?
Yes, sir. Just really briefly on this, I don't know if it's necessarily germane to the topic, but it's hard to have a conversation about tax relief without spending relief. And so in this context, if you have population growth in a particular area, there's ways to limit the property tax liability for everyone in the area by establishing a really robust levy limit, which can account for population growth and some inflation as well. And I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, no, good point. So, Kendall.
Yeah, no, I'll just say ditto. I absolutely agree. I think that definitely looking at the levy limit side, and then also looking at the budget side, and actually, focusing in on the spending side. And you mentioned some of the work that we've done, and we just have been pointing out that a lot of the local government budgets have been growing far beyond the rate of population growth and inflation. And that's a problem that does drive taxation. So I think that, looking at how we can align budgets, local budgets and local spending decisions more closely with the local economy would be a really good thing to do if we're going to focus on reducing taxation.
Thanks, Dwayne.
Yeah, one thing, I think that we haven't learned from some of the growth that's happened, like in the eastern Montana when they had the oil boom. You got a big deal going on in Lewistown now with new jobs and housing construction. One thing, when we add debt to the water and sewer departments for that expansion, we're affecting all the local people that have been there forever. And instead of charging a fee for people to hook up that pays for all those additions to those systems, I know it's not a tax, but it really is to the people there, because the growth is getting shifted to those people. And that's what makes them scream about some of the stuff happening, because my water bill went up so I could provide water to somebody else that came in.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, a lot of cities deal with that using impact fees above and beyond a normal sewer hookup fee too. But you're right. I mean, we saw that here in Polston when we went from a brand new, went up to a $20 million new sewer treatment plant. And people were used to, a $50 sewer bill, and now all of a sudden it's over $100. So it really does impact to help subsidize that current growth.
Mr. Chairman, this is Ron. Maybe to help put this a little bit all together, I guess in my mind, and I know when we were taking notes, it's really hard to separate a couple of these topic areas. Like, for example, the demand on local government services, and then go another couple, 2, 3 down, 15, 10, 420, the rate of growth. I mean, I think they're all going to be connected, I think, in this analysis. And I see on your notes here, you do have the Senate Bill 511, note there. That could be a nice place for this committee to not really start, but, really start some in-depth analysis. That was a bill that was developed by Senator Zolnikoff that the Department of Revenue was able to build out a fairly robust live action model that showed some of those changes. It had some of those population plus inflation, basically what would happen if you started adjusting some of those metrics. So as a future agenda item, that could be, at least, a big, if not the entire portion of your meeting, where you review that model and we actually get to do some live examples potentially.
No, that's a good point, Ryan. And, I more or less crossed this particular issue out because, as you said, just down below a couple items, we're talking about a cap down below and all, also other flexibility. So I think that all our discussion leads right into that next couple of agenda items down. So any other comments before we move on here? All right, the next one had to do with public relations improvement, disconnect between tax bills and services, needs transparency. I think Sandra kind of brought out an example too, and what we've been working on, at least in the Revenue Interim Committee and some other local government committees, is what does your tax bill look like? Can you tell me which levies were voted and which are non-voted? Kind of educate the taxpayer a little bit. The pie charts that are available for taxpayers to look at if they actually go to the local government website and look at that. One other thing that I just thought, how else could we maybe measure, my tax bill? Is, we, in schools we have, how much do we spend per student? Is there something that, how much does a local government spend per taxpayer? Or per population, per 100 individuals in a municipality or location. Maybe that would be helpful in comparing that to from one jurisdiction to the other. So I don't know if anybody has any comments on that particular issue. Sandra?
Yeah, I really like that idea. A lot of my constituents are always asking, like, I pay all these taxes, I'm almost taxed out of my home, but what benefit is it to me, even though we have all these potholes and the response time from fire and police is drastically slowing down. So I think that having that number, what amount are per taxpayer is actually happening, I think that would be really beneficial.
Yeah, I think the per person, per 100 individuals within your city, something like that, because then you're going to measure the renters too. Obviously, renters are paying taxes indirectly. So you kind of need to look at your overall population as to, how much are you spending to serve a particular population. Senator McGilvery.
Yeah, just looking at my tax bill here, and it took me a long time to figure out which of these sections of this bill are voted and non-voted. It seemed like there'd be a simple way to show a taxpayer how many of these mills are voted and how many are not.
Okay, Justin.
Some states require, like, they publish local government performance dashboards on various things so that you can like look up, say, like, what is the average response time for fire service in your area? And then you can also choose some comparable areas, whether it's your neighbor or just another town that you think is available. So fire response is one, like, the cost of like how much is spent on sewer versus something else. So an idea looking at what other states perhaps do on this.
Sure. Great idea. Any other comments? All right. So seeing none, we'll move on down to the next item, which we started a little bit already. Reform the cap design, and the cap doesn't allow flexibility, need for smoothing. We discussed that. The half rate of inflation cap drives increases to fees, voted levies, et cetera. And, I just threw at the bottom there, review 1510 420 MCA, which is very complicated for those of you who haven't walked through that. It's not only complicated for an average taxpayer, but for local government. And the more you make things more complicated, of course, and you put limits, there's always a way around a limit. So, and I think we've seen some of that uniqueness going on in Montana and across jurisdictions where sure, they hit the limit of half the rate of inflation, but then using special districts to offload general fund expenditures into some type of special districts. We've done some legislation on that, slowing that down a little bit also. But, we always hear about local governments, well, we're limited to half the rate of inflation, but I know we've had charts showing that, well, your growth on your annual budget is much higher than half the rate of inflation. So how could that be if we have a limit on it? Well, there's other things that aren't really included in that limit, and one of the biggest items is voted levies. They're not subject to that limit. And then also new growth too, that is added on top of the half the rate of inflation. So you can kind of see as budgets grow, there's other ways around growing it. And so that's where I threw in Senate Bill 511, which is probably something that we need to, like Ryan just pointed out, to have a further discussion and really dig down into that. We really didn't have much time in the last legislative session. I think a lot of legislators didn't really understand that, but it was more of a hard cap. So, and I think that bill ended up maybe at 4.75% growth. So a budget you just got rid of the half the rate of inflation stuff, and it was capped at 4.75 with full inflation. But we never really did address though and then, you know, a certain percentage of the new growth had to be included back into the budget. And I can't remember where we ended up, 50 or 75%, but we never really identified special districts. I don't think we encompassed those in there too, but I think there's some good discussion going forward. It's probably a major topic for maybe one subcommittee or the group as a whole to get a little more education on, is there a way to simplify or eliminate 1510 420 and make it much easier for those of us who follow property taxes and for local governments to operate under. So does anybody have any comments or thoughts on that? All right. Well, I thought that would bring out a little more comments, although it's a very complex subject also.
And Mr. Chairman, this is Ryan, and maybe the absence of of responses, this is a big nut to crack, I guess, admittedly too. And so maybe if it would be helpful for the subcommittee, even a good place to start, if you would like, we can certainly work with Department of Revenue and work on some of those modeling efforts and get some of that so we can have a live action demonstration. And I think starting to build some of those pieces back up from the ground will probably lend itself for a plenty of robust discussion moving forward.
Yeah, no, I think that'd be very helpful. So, okay, special district reform. No limits on fees. Spending limitation is important. Fees and assessment. You know, like I just had mentioned, you got to bring those in if you're going to have spending caps. Temptations to create districts with fees or assessments rather than taxes. So I think, and I just put over there, we need to incorporate fees somehow into any type of cap that we might have. Just to give a little bit of legislative background, Senator McGilvery and I worked on a bill in 21 and got passed. It had to do with some special district abuses going on across the state. I think we've kind of wrangled those in a little bit, but there's still work that needs to be done on special districts and fees, etc. Any comments or thoughts on any of that?
Well, I guess I'll jump in there. I've had over the years, I've had some, Mr. Chair, I've had some what you might call unhealthy, probably heartburn with special districts. I think, you know, when you look at how they're created, it's interesting that state law requires a different means for creation of a special district. What happens, at least in my experience, is that property owners get a letter, and in this letter it will say something like, here's this district we're proposing, do you agree or not? So if you throw that away, you're basically voting for the creation of the district. So you have to check the box and send it back in and say, if you protest it, you have to check the box and send it back into the municipality to protest the creation of the district. And then there are percentage of property owner thresholds that determine whether this initiative moves on or whether it has to go to the voter or whatever. And it's kind of complex, or a little more complicated than a voted levy, for example. Then if that district is created, all bets are off, in my opinion. I mean, rates for those special districts are set, at least in our municipality. I'm sure it's true across the state. They are set by the governing body. In our case, that's 5 people. And I can share a recent experience where in the course of 2 years, street maintenance fees for residential went up over 28%, and for commercial, they actually more than doubled to 104.4%. So the limitation is pretty much the fiscal restraint of the governing body, which we're not maybe necessarily known for that kind of thing. But so there's, you know, that those are kind of problems that I see with the districts. And as I mentioned at our meeting on the 14th, there is this idea that they're starting to creatively tax people through the use of assessments. And my understanding is that there's a distinction between fees and assessments and taxes. And so those are, I guess, just quickly some struggles that I see in our municipality. And I've always wondered why the state legislature doesn't take it up. But then I found out at our general meeting that special districts only represent about 4% of maybe revenue across the state. But when you get to municipalities, like my property tax bill, special districts represent about 12% of what I have to pay to local government. So anyway, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think we need kind of need a refresher on the bill that we passed. Just to give a little background on that, it was, you know, municipalities, there was only a handful of them creating a special district and creating it for, let's say, $500,000 in revenue. And then after that, it was the doors were open and they were offloading upwards to $2-3 million into these special districts from their general fund, which wasn't subject. And so we put somewhat of a stopper on that, but we do need to go back and look at that. And as I had commented before about, it probably needs to be pulled in any cap that we might have. So Commissioner Holmquist, you probably got a comment on this. You have to unmute yourself there, Pam.
Okay, there we go. How's that?
Good.
All right. I got in a little late on as a panelist, but I want to go back to 1510-420 a little bit because there was a comment made that the counties actually their budgets go up over half of the rate of inflation sometimes. I think sometimes our budgets are taken, and each year, of course, our budget fluctuates depending on what type of a project we're doing. In Flathead County, our budget fluctuates quite a bit. If we have a large project, we take money out of our savings and put it into our budget, and then it looks like we're spending a lot, but actually it's coming out of our savings. It's not tax dollars that we're, it's tax dollars, but it's tax dollars that we've saved. So I want to look closer at that on those forms that were passed out earlier to narrow down and drill down into what are actually our budget is, excluding all of those special projects we're working on that year. So I think that makes a difference when you start looking at how much money we're spending. So just a thought.
Yeah, I know that's a good comment. I see Julia Patton, you're on here from LFD. I don't know if you can kind of comment on the numbers that you guys came up with. Was it just a total overall budget on those numbers that you came up with, the growth rate, or if you took some of the special revenue and expenditures out? Julie, are you available there? If you guys want to promote her up, or if maybe she's stepped away too, I don't know. We can come back to that here in a second. Tom, Senator McGilver, you have a question, comment?
Yeah, I just want to comment on 1510-420 here. And the city may have needs higher than 1/2 the rate of inflation over the past 3 years. But when you have a city like Billings with a lot of new growth and they add that back in over the top, then they're able to grow at much greater than the rate of inflation and population growth. So I think that has to be considered. And that's different. You know, if you have an Eastern Montana county, for example, that's not growing at all, that impacts them differently than you have a Yellowstone County that's growing quite a bit.
Yeah, no, good point on that too. And the measurements we have are difficult. I know Legislative Fiscal Division has been collecting a lot of good data, but the data is only as good as information you get. And there's some data from local governments and schools that is at times not always really transparent, and it's difficult to compare one jurisdiction to another, but they're doing a fantastic job in trying to get some more information so that we can make some better decisions when it comes to changing policies.
Mr. Chairman, this is Ryan. Julia has been promoted into the panelist section. I'm not sure if she has anything to add, but she's here if she comes back.
All right. Julia, are you there right now?
Yes, I am.
So the question was, I don't know if you heard it about, when you guys are looking at the growth rate in counties and cities, what are you taking out some of the extraordinary revenue items or expenditures, or are you just looking at the flat total amount?
When we are looking at our tool that shows growth rates for cities, counties, etc., that's going to include all taxes paid to those entities. So it's not going to exclude items that have larger growth rates. And depending on the entity, we have a limited ability to dive deeper into what those expenditures might be. At the county level, it's a little easier than at the city level or special district level.
So you said all taxes going in or fees, etc.
We're looking at taxes paid, so they are mill based. Anything that's fee based, like a $250 fee for using the county dump, for instance, wouldn't count. But anything that's mill based is included in our tool, and there's a separate dashboard that shows the fees. But again, it doesn't have the same level of detail as the main data model that we have.
Okay. So like Commissioner's Holmquist comment, what about transfers from their reserves into a budget? Is that included in growth or not, or?
Probably not, because again, we're looking at the taxes paid in that particular year. But I can confirm that.
And then also what about grants from maybe the federal government or something?
This would be just property taxes on our tool.
Perfect. Ralph, did you have you had your hand up there for a minute? It's down now.
I think the issue, what the data Julia works with is what she gets from the taxes levy report. And Dylan can say this more accurately, but we've been looking at the issue of what they budget. So if you're building up reserves or drawing down reserves, your mill levies might change, and you might be developing reserves to do a special project. So I think that is something that's why we brought in the Local Government Services Bureau and looking at some of those budgets a little bit more carefully, because the other things are going on, and the non-levy revenue issue also shows up in there, because they budget to their revenue needs, they fill them with non-levy, they build up reserves. It can change, so any 1 year's number may not really be a good representation of their underlying cost and expenditures pressures.
All right. Any other comments, questions? All right, so next item is review HB 587, which I think we can probably cross this off our list. The School Education Subcommittee is looking at that. And just a refresher for everybody what that really was. It segregated the 95 mills into a special revenue account, and so that it could easily be traced as to where those dollars were going. And then also the growth in the 95 mills starting, I believe, in this year, 2024, a percentage of that growth in the 95 mills is going to go back to local governments to offset property taxes there. So I know the Education Subcommittee is looking at that. Do we need to make changes to that particular model in regard to the 95 mills? I don't know if anybody else has a comment or thought on any of that. Senator McGilvery. Unmute yourself there, Tom.
Just curious, if you had a homestead exemption or this excess above the excess growth in that 95 mills, going back to local governments, and then also a homestead exemption, how do you know that local governments just don't raise? How do you know that they are actually reducing property taxes with that? And how is that? How do you hold them accountable? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I believe in that legislation in 587. I believe that had to be used for reductions, and maybe Ryan can correct me if I'm wrong here, but it wasn't in that half the rate of inflation in 1510 for 20. Is that correct, Ryan or Julia or somebody who might know?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think you're correct. I mean, the increase or the increment, the 55% of the growth would in the future then be dedicated into the local retirement, which then does have an impact of reducing mills. But I think you're exactly right, Senator McGillivray. I mean, is there a compelling factor to absolutely make that happen? No, not necessarily. But you know, the state, I guess the legislative intent was to facilitate that at the local level.
Well, it applies to the homestead exemption too, and that's a question I have. If we did a homestead exemption and say the city's lost revenue because of that, what's to prevent them from just increasing mills or doing I mean, I know they could do another mill levy, but say they have mills extra, how do you know that that's actually going to help reduce the existing property owner's property tax?
Yeah, so the Tax Fairness Committee is looking at the homestead exemptions, and obviously you got a couple. You could have one that's backfilled with income taxes, which doesn't result in a shift to property taxpayers, but results in a shift to income taxpayers. Or you could just have a homestead exemption that does result in a shift to other taxpayers. So they're working through all of that. I don't think they're probably going to look at, well, if due to homestead exemptions, this local jurisdiction loses $1 million, that, hey, you have to reduce your budget by $1 million now. Probably not something that is fair or would have support.
So just to be clear, a homestead exemption is simply going to shift taxes to other entities within that jurisdiction.
Most likely, or income taxpayers. Those are the kind of the two different models.
Right.
Dylan, you got your hand up there. Do you have something to comment on this, or?
Yeah, just to add to the discussion a little bit to Senator McGillivray. So I mean, 1510-420 is the sort of thing that guarantees the mechanism you're talking about, in the sense that if you lower the taxable value, local governments are entitled to levy the amount they levied in the prior year plus some extra. So if you change nothing and lower the taxable value, that drives mills up. So if your taxable value got lowered, you are better off. And if you were not one of the people whose taxable value was lowered by the law, you're worse off. There are mechanisms for backfilling local governments that the legislature has used through the Class 8 reimbursements. And what that does is it takes state general fund dollars, which is usually the income tax, like Senator Hertz talked about, and gives that to local governments through the entitlement share, and then forces them to subtract that amount from their authorized budget in 1510-420. And what that does is it makes it so that the local government is whole. They're still getting the same amount of tax revenue dollars, but it's using state general fund money to backfill that loss in taxable value to prevent it from shifting onto other properties.
So in some of the comments at the Tax Fairness Committee the other day about that was, you look at our general fund and the income tax dollars, where 93-4% of it is going to fund education, incarceration, and medication. And if we start eating into that, then with property tax relief, then does that then eat into those three big items that we fund with through the general fund? So it's you really got to look at all, and the Tax Fairness Subcommittee is really looking at that and discussing that. Dwayne.
Yeah, I had a question on what was just said in regard to when we reduced the business equipment tax, we increased the funding made the funding back up through the entitlement share. Did that get subtracted from the county budget, or did the county get the entitlement share plus got the right to collect the same amount of money?
Chairman Hertz and Dwayne. So they do have to subtract that out of their budget. So if you go on the local government website that was toured earlier and look at mill determination forms, 1510-420 forms from fiscal year 23. And then again in this coming fiscal year, because of House Bill 212 that got passed, or sorry, 222, I think. There's a line item in the amount of money in their budget that they're allowed to grow by. So they're going to get their inflation and they get, so they get their inflation, but then they have to subtract out the Class 8 reimbursement. And then that new number is what they divide their tax base into to set their mills. That happens exactly once because, again, you take it out one time and then that amount that you take out compounds over time.
Okay. Manish?
Yes, sir. Thanks. Just one more item on the homestead exemption. I know we're not really wading into that here necessarily, but obviously it does create some shifts. The other thing it does is if you look at the case study in Texas where the homestead exemption was raised dramatically at the ballots this last fall, there are a number of school districts wherein the median home value is actually below what the homestead exemption allows. So there'll be zero property tax in some instances going into the school system, or dramatically reduced property taxes going into the school system, which is going to create its own budgetary issues. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation as well.
Thank you for that point. All right, any other comments or thoughts? All right, let's move along here, trying to keep us within our 2 hours, but the next item is levy fatigue. No sunset on levies. Should there be a 2-year reappraisal cycle, et cetera? So some of the solutions over there that have been discussed are limit levies to a dollar amount plus inflation. So I think what we're seeing a lot right now in Sandra brought it up. Missoula's looking at a $7 million fire and safety levy. There's other levies that are going to be on the ballot here this spring. There's schools. I mean, we've seen all across the state about schools struggling with their budgets. Mainly their COVID dollars have run out, and they've used some of those COVID dollars for their budgets, and now they don't have that money anymore. So they're looking at dramatic cuts or levies. And so that, to me, and I brought some legislation in regard to this, I think that brings us into levy fatigue. And we've seen some of that recently. And this will be good as we work through the spring election cycle, is how many of these levies actually pass, and are people concerned about their property taxes? And so with that, I think one of the solutions is looking at and getting some information on sunsetting levies, or only let a levy live for so long before the voters have to reauthorize it. Obviously, a bond levy lives as long as it takes to basically redeem the bonds. But then you have other levies. It might be a fire and safety levy. It might be a recreational parks and rec levy, a number of different levies. And some of them are at a fixed levy amount. So as appraised values go up, taxable values go up, there's kind of a windfall of that. I guess that's what you could talk about, the 95 mills. And what the counties were talking about that the state received in regard to a static mill. So I think one of the things that we need to look at is just that, sunsetting levies, and maybe no more levies where you can levy a fixed number of mills, but a fixed dollar amount, and then allow that fixed dollar amount to increase at the rate of inflation or some other level. It might be tied to population growth and inflation. So there's just a lot of different thoughts that in regard to that. So anybody have any comments, thoughts?
Mr. Chair, just a quick example. Here in Helena, we're looking at a number of school levies, and the city is putting forward a public safety levy. Both of those would increase, just looking at my tax bill. I have kind of an average house here in Helena, over 20% for each of those. The schools, what I pay the schools would increase by at least 20%, and the city by 21. So yeah, those are some significant numbers we're looking at.
Sandra?
Yeah, one thing that we discussed in the education subcommittee that Senator Morjo, my fellow Missoulian, and I kind of disagreed on. He was a little hesitant about my suggestion of having a few thousand voters can vote yes on a levy that impacts the entire city and county of Missoula. But a lot of people don't vote in that particular race. So I was wondering what it would take to possibly have the solution of having a mandatory 2/3 of registered voters have to vote yes for it to actually pass, or something along those lines. And I know that that's going to be a very kind of a difficult measurement, but it's something that I want to kind of look into if it's a possibility.
Yeah, and that's actually going to be discussed on the next agenda item too, right below us. Any other thoughts? All right. Well, let's move right in. Sandra keyed that up for us. So voter levies are a significant issue. So timing and turnout of particular bond elections. So this possible solution is require bond and levy elections in the general election date, or or looking at increasing voter turnout requirements for passage. And I think one thing we can go out there and we can look at what other states have done. And I know there's other states. I've carried legislation like this in the past, and I think there's about 17 to 20 states that have super majority type election approval in order to pass certain types of mill or bond levies, just because you're taxing the vast majority of other taxpayers, and you should have a little bit higher. Now, I was at the discussion too, listening to that Senator Mosier brought up, and something I had mentioned earlier before. Well, we're doing all mail out ballots, so particularly if you don't turn your ballot back in, that's a no vote. So yeah, it is. It is. So, but I think it's something that we probably need to gather information, and that information's out there provided by NCSL. And I think Legislative Service Divisions already has a lot of that information as to how has those, when you require higher turnouts or moving them to general election or other dates, how does that impact the levy approval or not? So I think it's worth exploring that. All right, any other comments, thoughts on that? The next item is analyze leaks in the system that create shifts. And I think we've already tackled some of that. TIFs, we can kind of push that to the side. As Ryan pointed out, we're probably going to get a TIF education later on down the line. But another issue that is being worked on right now too is agriculture classification, which the Department of Revenue currently has a working group made up of stakeholders, legislators, taxpayers, et cetera, looking at the possibility of revamping the automatic ag classifications, which can tremendously reduce your property taxes on the land value. Generally, that doesn't impact the improvements on the land, just the value of the land. But I know that's something that they're looking at. It's probably an unfairness in the system when you might see acreage of identical sizes. One is classified as agriculture and the other is not. So any thoughts or comments on that? It's probably something we can cross off our list, that particular item, since we'll talk about TIFs later, and there's already the ag classification group that's working through the Department of Revenue to address that situation. Okay, review property tax assistance programs. We did get an overview of those available programs. There was a couple that we didn't really mention. I was just looking on the Department of Revenue site. I wasn't really aware of these, but it's called a natural disaster reduction relief. So, which makes sense. There's one for forest products. So if you have a bad fire that whips through your land and you've got forest classification, you can get the value on that adjusted. Might be beetle infestation too. So there's some disaster relief for those. There's also disaster relief for regular property owners if you you might have had a flood, completely destroyed part of the property. The property is no longer usable for its original intent. And so there's some relief for that. But as Justin pointed out when we were talking about this earlier, there's probably, there's some things we need to look at, whether in regards to the mean testing. And I had brought that up too in the PTAP and the various programs. Do we need to look at some of the mean testing that's going on in there and how we're paying for that in regards to shifts? Are we, some of those, like the elderly renter's credit, that is being paid by income tax dollars. Do we need to look at maybe some of these relief programs being paid through another venue than shifting them? So there's a lot of different issues that we can look at. So does anybody have any comments or thought on that particular item? Senator McGilvery.
Yeah, just on the means testing. I mean, it seems to me that we should look at Social Security income. And if you have to raise up or increase your qualifications, but it should be looked at because technically a person could have a high Social Security income and other maybe non-reportable taxable income or something like that. But I do think it should be looked at, my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Dylan, so Senator McGilvery brought up an interesting point. If you're still on the line there, or somebody, obviously you got Social Security. And what about non-taxable income, like tax exempt interest, things like that, is that included in when you're looking at means testing, or is that excluded?
I'm gonna reveal a little weakness in my tax knowledge in that I mostly deal with property taxes, so I'm less familiar with these. But I believe that what it specifically looks at is taxable income plus some things that would normally allow to be deducted, like business losses and capital losses. But like, for example, I don't think that it's looking at the entirety of your Social Security income. It's looking at the taxable portion of your Social Security income. I don't think it's looking at your Roth IRA distributions. It's looking at your taxable IRA distributions. So,
Alan, what about capital gains and dividends and things of that nature? Is that inclusive?
correct. So it's specifically for PTAP and the elderly homeowner renter credit. It's federal adjusted gross income, and then also it adds back in some things that would not normally be counted in FAGI, like capital losses and business expenses.
And I think you might be adding back tax exempt interest too on municipal bonds. Not 100% sure, but I'm guessing it probably does. But it's probably something we need to look at a little bit deeper on these, when we look at these different taxpayer system programs, possible modifications to those to make them sure they're fair and encompassing a group.
Mr. Chairman, this is Ryan. I think that that's definitely doable at a future meeting as well. You made the mention at the beginning of the meeting that there have been maybe not several, but a handful of recent changes to some of these assistance programs. The most recent being the threshold going to 350,000. I know that Senator Hogan had worked a couple biennium to maybe adjusting the PTAP programs around. So I know those models do exist as well. And, that's something that might be primed for a live demo or a session at an upcoming subcommittee meeting too, sir.
Yeah, good idea. All right. And then I have one other item that's not on the list that was sent to me. And that has to do with bonds. About are there caps related to bonds, such as general obligation bonds, revenue bonds? Obviously, general obligation bonds, I believe most of those are have to be approved by the taxpayers. But you got some other bonds, such as revenue type bonds, that are not, but they usually derive themselves. Those are usually similar to like sewer and water districts. You also have TIF bonds that aren't approved by taxpayers, but generally are approved by the local government entity or somebody they gave that authority to issue those bonds. So I think looking at the whole bonding issue, which is a big part of your tax bill, it can be at times, probably is something that we need to pull into and when we're looking at caps or limitations on property taxes, we probably need to look at bonds and kind of get a general understanding of how those are regulated and what kind of caps might be on those. Any comments on that? Okay,
Senator Hertz.
Sandra.
Yeah, I at least in Missoula, when I brought up my concern about how much debt that Missoula is in, I was told that we are in the proper amount of debt to have a proper credit rating within as a municipality. So I'm very much in favor of looking at caps on how much debt we can get into and looking at that. So this is something that I would like to run the numbers on and pursue possibly.
Okay. Any other thoughts, comments? Senator McGilvery?
Isn't there already caps on municipal debt already in the statute?
I don't know that. Ryan, anybody have any knowledge of that? Anybody out there?
I think there is.
There are qualifying debt tiers based on the amount of taxable value that counties and municipalities have. So there are debt limits.
Probably something we need to review, and so we have good information if we're looking at making any changes to that, or if there are any necessary changes to that.
One more thing, Senator Hertz, on the means testing. I don't want to beat this to death, but I think there should be an asset test there too. As a financial advisor, I could always manipulate people's income so they paid almost no taxes or little tax by the various means by which you take income. So, you could have a significant amount of assets and be getting away with significant amount of property tax reduction when, have $1 million in cash. A couple years ago, that would have generated almost no income.
Yeah, I would agree with you, and I think that's something we need to look at and see if that types of means testing is in there. I don't think it is, but obviously you want to exclude their personal residence. You don't want to force them to sell something they've been living in for 30, 40 years just because it's valued high. But if I've got stocks and bonds, or if I got a lot of money sitting in a 401k plan that I don't need to tap into until I'm 72 or very little, I think those are all things that we probably need to consider.
And you could have, you could manage your stock portfolio, selling the losses, letting the gains defer, and not only not showing income, but showing losses that you're carrying forward too. So I think it should be looked at.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So is there anything else that anybody wants to throw on to this list of issues or possible solutions or things that we really didn't cover and you think we might want to talk about? Senator McGilvery?
Yeah, I know we didn't talk solutions. Is that a plan for the next meeting, or shall I bring something up now that I'd like to talk about?
Sure. I mean, we did talk about a few solutions here, but yeah, we don't want to get in depth, but if you got something you want to bring up, let's hear it.
Well, I'd like to see what a local option targeted toward tourists would be, that 100% of that has to go back to taxpayers. And that assumes that we're also looking at some of these other issues that make it more difficult to just pass bond levies or levies rather. But it seems to me in a city like Billings, where you have substantive tourism, a lot of traffic from northern Wyoming coming into Billings, paying no tax at all. And I think Wyoming might be doing something like this too, that we could look at that there could be a substantive reduction in local property tax in that that the local option that I'm paying is significantly less than the property tax break that I'd be receiving from a tax, again, that's targeted more toward tourism. So I'd like to explore that.
So the tax fairness subcommittee is exploring that, along with not only local option tax, but they're also looking at a seasonal gas tax. That would be a direct buy down on property taxes. Also, in regard to that local option tax, the sharing of those taxes with connecting counties, you know, because us in the smaller counties, we drive into the big cities to buy things. Also looking at a seasonal bed tax increase to buy down property taxes. So that is on their list right now, Senator McGilvery, and so instead of us bogging down into that, I would suggest that maybe you go back and look at that particular hearing. I don't think that recording's up yet, but you can listen in on that, and then that will be reported at our meeting next week. So all the subcommittees will come back and say, here's some of the topics that we talked about, and we can discuss those in further detail and make sure we're not duplicating.
Okay, great. Is there another subcommittee that's looking at a tax on short-term rentals, or getting that to a like a class 4 commercial property rate?
Yes, I believe the tax fairness was also looking at different models having to do with that in regards to a different classification.
All right.
Commissioner Galt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, like Senator McGilvery, was looking for a place to start this, and a place never came up, so I apologize for dragging this meeting on. But my constituents in Marr County is a pretty simple property tax schedule, not a lot of levies or special districts. It was pretty obvious that the problem that we're dealing with came from the high appraisals. And I was just wondering if the legislature has looked at something similar to a California Proposition 13, where those appraisals were rolled back several years, and then adjustments going forward for improvements, additions, sales, and then going forward from there, the same thing. Use adjustments for sales and improvements to set the valuations for the properties.
So yeah, there was a couple of bills that brought forward. Senator Molnar brought a bill, and of course they're working on a possible type constitutional amendment. Part of the issues with some of that has to do with the need to amend the Constitution, because the way the Constitution reads in regard to you know, in order to do things like that. Some of the concerns too were having how you could have two houses on the same street, both you may be a very similar value, and one is paying a significant higher tax rate than the other. How does that impact, you know, new families getting into a house, fairness issues, etc. So it's not, I don't think any of the other subcommittees have really looked at that. So I don't have an issue. Maybe that's something that we need to put in here to kind of educate all of us. You know, is that a possible solution? And what are, if it is, what are the problems with that? Because it's been well vetted, but I think it needs to be educated amongst all of us. So I'll put that down.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that.
Okay. Sandra.
Thanks. So I did get two notifications, and I think one was canceled, but you mentioned well, we're going to talk about it next week for the actual like overview. Are you talking about the 18th, or did I get the calendar wrong on that one?
Ryan, I think it's the 12th.
Yeah, I think the full committee, we have a week, we have a full week next week, and then it's the following week. I think you're right, Sandra. Let me double check that though. I was
Okay,
probably the one saying next week, but you're right. I think it is the following week.
Yeah, I've got one on the 18th of my calendar and one on the 12th, so I'm not sure which one it is.
Yeah, the 12th was the initial placeholder, and I think because the legislative, partially, there's too many people that we've just had other things going on. So I think it's the 18th at 1 o'clock is what we have.
Yep.
And
All right.
now. Yep.
Okay, Senator McGilvery?
What about smoothing? Is anybody looking at that issue, or is that something in our purview?
There was a little bit of discussion on that in the tax fairness. But I think,
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think that's right. I mean, I think it really, the smoothing, many times it comes down to the differences. What happens if we were to go back to a 6-year reappraisal cycle or standardize? I mean, some of that discussion definitely came up. I don't remember them explicitly picking that up, more acknowledging that it's more of a tool in the tool chest, if you will, that when you assess and when you phase that in, more of a consideration, but it's certainly it's certainly a topic to be discussed.
Is that something you want to add here, Senator McGilvery?
Yeah, smoothing, and also I thought about if DOR, one of the problems maybe, and you guys, DOR could speak to this, is that trying to assess the valuations of all property in the state every 2 years seems burdensome and things may be overlooked. Why couldn't we consider appraising a third of the properties every 2 years and smoothing as well?
So I'm sure one of the Department of Revenue people might be able to comment, but this was discussed too at the tax fairness issue. And on an overall statewide level, they have standards they have to meet. And I think the numbers that when you compare our appraisals to market value, we were from the 95 percentile up to 102%. So we were well within the range that they need to be. But that obviously that's statewide. There's obviously individuals who are outside of those realms due to certain circumstances, and that's the need for the AB 26. But I don't know, is there someone from the Department of Revenue who can comment on that particular subject that I didn't misspeak on? Bryce is there. There we go.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll speak to it, I guess, from tax policy and research's side. So we are the ones who do the quality of reappraisal report that Senator Hertz was talking about. So what that report does is it looks at, so the lien date for the most recent reappraisal was January 1st of 2022. So what we did was we took sales from right after that lien date up through March of 2022 and said, how well does our assessed value compare to what that property actually sold for? And that's the standard test that the International Association of Assessment Officers suggests for grading mass appraisal. And we are within the IAAO standards and pretty close to 100% of full market value. Like Senator Hertz says, that's a statewide average, and there's certainly a lot of variation that can happen between that. I know that, when we moved down from a 6-year cycle to a 2-year cycle, we didn't get more boots on the ground to deal with the appraisal. In fact, I think that coincided with, in 2017, a fairly significant reduction in property assessment staff. I think the main argument against extending the reappraisal cycle is that the spike that happened in the 2-year cycle will happen in a 6-year cycle. It's just a question of when you realize that gain. So does it make sense and so when property values are rapidly appreciating, locking in an older value does help people. But if property values are decreasing, as maybe happened in the East and with the Bakken boom and then kind of bust that happened in the early 2010s, locking in a high value is actually detrimental to those homeowners. So insofar as property values go up, having a shorter assessment cycle is worse for homeowners. but the Constitution does direct the Department of Revenue to value property at 100% of market value. It's kind of hard to argue that extending the appraisal timeline coincides with that goal, but it's certainly a legislative prerogative what the reappraisal cycle is.
Thank you.
So, in Senator McGilvery, I think some of the other options that we have, if all levies floated up and down based on appraised values, we wouldn't probably quite get ourselves into this spike that we've seen. So that was one of the thoughts of, okay, we no longer will, you can't just pass a levy with mills. It's got to be a dollar amount so that exactly, you don't get these windfalls when all of a sudden values go up. So that's another way of just working around the big spikes in appraised values. And 15-10-420 was supposed to help with that, but there's too many workarounds right now with 15-10-420. So
Just a quick question. Could you, maybe we're talking solutions here, but could you take all voted mills and convert them to dollars and freeze them going forward as dollar amounts versus mills?
yeah, I think that's probably an option that we could look at. You probably want to give them too. You have to have some type of inflation increase on that. That's where sunsets might come in too. Fine, you can convert these, but they need to sunset every pick in a year, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, and voters have to come back and reapprove those. So just a lot of different options out there. All right, anything else anybody wants to add to the list, solution-wise or? Okay. So I think now, thanks for bearing with us. It is 3:17. I've got a few more items, probably another, depending on how long public comment takes. I think I'll just keep moving along. So now, before we kind of finalize things and summarize what we've talked about today and what we're going to report out, let's open it up to public comment. So who is, I guess if you are an attendee and want some public comment, raise your hand or mention the tax in the chat group. And I see the first one up is Bob Story. So if you guys could allow Bob to speak there, we can listen to his comments. I don't know if you need to promote him or if someone
Yeah,
can.
we do. Let me double check that that's happening.
And anybody else out there who, if you're out there on the attendee list and got some public comment, please raise your hand so we can get that taken care of. It looks like got a couple now out there. Cindy Johnson got her hand up. Bob Story.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you, Bob.
All right, I finally got the mute turned off. I have
All
a
right.
few, I think you guys are on a good track here, and I just have a couple of comments on some things. First of all, there's been a few questions about how you could appraise and value property and stuff, and I think, Mr. Chairman, you've probably heard some pretty good legal analysis from your staffer on the Revenue Committee about some of the court cases that limit what you can and can't do, and it might be good to look at a few of those, as far as the suggestion of valuing certain portions of the property every year, 2 years or something, and others not. That was tried before, and the court said you couldn't do that. And if values go down, you have to implement those immediately. You can't carry them over. The courts ruled on that back in 98 or 99. And so there's some court cases that limit what you can do. Constitutionally, there's things you can change in the law, but you don't have to value residential property at 100% of market value. That's just statute. The court says, or the Constitution says, you value things how the legislature tells you to value them. Anyway, looking at tax relief, of course, there's several ways you can do it, depending on how targeted you want it to be. You know, if you want to do mill reductions, that reduces taxes, but it applies to everyone. Rate reductions will kind of tie it into certain classes of property, or else you get into, as you talked earlier on, the circuit breaker type things that, you know, the PTAP program and stuff, what really drills down to who do you want the tax relief to go to, so you can kind of limit your costs. 1510-420, I think, is something that should be looked at. It's been on the books for 25 years. I drafted that statute and pretty much know how it's supposed to work. It's the Supreme Court messed that up a little bit in their ruling, I think, but in the end, it actually served its purpose of limiting the growth of taxes. It's a taxpayer protection statute, not a government protection statute. But so it is fairly stringent for the taxes it applies to. It doesn't apply to school levies, district levies, because they're actually more limited than city and county local government levies are. The issue is, of course, as you well know, is the equalization mills that everyone calls the 95 mills that really aren't 95 mills except for the way that they've been administered. But you know, I think if you're really wanting to do something that's significant in tax relief, you have to limit the growth of those so that you don't get that windfall every 2 years when you have a reappraisal. Senate Bill 587 will mitigate that to some extent, but you have to understand that Senate Bill 587 takes that windfall growth. Well, it takes significant part of the growth in the equalization mills and puts it back to property tax relief. And that's going to cause, because of that, that's going to cause more general fund income tax money to fill up the school funding formula. Because you'll give schools like a 3% growth in their budgets every year, but if the property tax revenue on the equalization mills doesn't grow by over 3%, you know, it kind of defeats some of the purposes of what was attempted under that. That money goes only back to certain counties, though, because it's a guaranteed tax base return, so it subsidizes those counties' teacher retirement funds. The money goes back in. Senator McGilvery is wondering where the money goes and how it guarantees tax relief. It goes into teacher retirement funds, and it subsidizes the levies in certain counties. And I think at some point in time, somebody has to get the map and says what counties are going to get this money and what counties are going to pay into it and not get anything back. But there was talk about several times about limiting voted levies to dollars rather than mills, and that's you need to look at 1510-425. That's the voted levy section of law, and that's where it gives the local or the entity the option of levying a certain number of dollars or a certain number of mills. And if you're in a taxing jurisdiction that's growing in value, you levy mills, because then you get more revenue every year. If you're a taxing jurisdiction that isn't growing or is shrinking, you levy dollars, then you can maintain that budget. And so the simple way to fix that would be eliminate the part about the mills and require all the voted levies to be in dollars, and then subject them to 1510-420. So that you'd have whatever you decide in 1510-420 or its replacement as far as inflation growth, that would apply then to those voted levies. So the special district law got changed about 2009, and it probably needs to be looked at because, as people have said, you know, some special districts are voted. You know, the commission, say a county commission can decide to set up a special district through a voted levy. We tried to do that in Stillwater County for a museum and got beat about 2-1. Some special districts can be set up by the governing body, as has been said there, and then they can set the fees and that. So, you know, it wouldn't hurt to at least revisit what the current state of the special district law is in this subcommittee, because I don't know if anybody's looked at that for a little while, and it probably wouldn't hurt. You talk about leaks in the system. Well, back to 1510-420. There's one part of 1510-420 that was implemented in 2001, and that allows local governments to run a permissive levy for their health care costs above what their base costs were in 2000. And the local governments got the legislature to approve that it's basically an exemption to 1510-420, so that as their health costs went up, they didn't have to erode their other services to pay them. So they get to raise their mill levies for cover that cost. And I don't know nobody's really monitoring that much. I know some counties don't levy a lot of mills for their employees' health care, but I know like the city of Missoula levies like 40 mills in that permissive levy to fund their health care. So you might have your staff pull up those permissive levies in healthcare and see what they've been doing over a period of time, because I think that's one of the places that's flying under the radar on what's causing the growth in property taxes. On the leaks, no one mentioned nonprofits. Nonprofit healthcare system in Montana is a huge industry. Lots of property, not paying property taxes on it. And, there used to be a little more monitoring of that by the Attorney General office about, what they had to do to maintain their nonprofit status. But, as they buy up private clinics and employ the doctors and the radiologists and those types of things, you're losing businesses that are being absorbed by the nonprofit industry, and that needs to be looked at. And then there was some discussion about bonding limits, and there are statutory bonding limits. Some of them are based on taxable value and some are based on market value, depending on. But the thing about bonding limits is every entity has a bonding limit. So the bonding limit for a county might be 100% of its taxable value, and the bonding limit for a school district might be 100% of its taxable value, and the bonding limit for a city might be either some percentage of taxable value will add up. Those add together. So now if you're in a city, in a school district, in a county, the bonding limit's 300% of your taxable value of your house. So, that's just kind of the way it is. And those haven't been looked at. I think I probably carried the last bill to deal with bonding limits, and that was back in the late 90s or early 2000s, when we made a lot of major changes to the tax base. So the bonding limits had to be updated, and they probably haven't been looked at since then. So you might want to look at bonding limits that are currently in the statute and how those might be adjusted or dealt with. Other than that, I think stay tuned, I guess, and see where you go. Thank you.
Thank you. Next person up is Gordon Oaklers. Oh, it's a Gordon. Go ahead, Gordon.
Oakers. Yeah, Gordon Oakers, Roosevelt County Commissioner. I'm on the Tax Fairness Committee. But for the local government, our 95 mills has been such a big deal. Is there any way that a guy could run some parameters? If a guy, the 95 mills are floating, is there a way we could limit that to a 3% growth per year? Because that's 3% is what the education grows per year. In the last 10 years, that 95 mills has grown 6% per year, with a big increase this last year. But is there a way got those 95 mills, if we're going to protect the taxpayers, those 95 mills somehow to that 3%? I like the HB 587 that kind of puts it in a separate fund and we'll give back some of that for equalization. But if we limit it to 3%, that would take less. So there'd be less to give back. You know, we're trying to protect the taxpayers. So I don't know if that'd be a solution to add that 3% statutory limit on the 95 mills if we're not going to, you know, float them.
Thanks, Gordon. Cindy Johnson.
I didn't have my hand up. Thanks.
Okay. I thought I saw your hand up at one point in time. So let me.
It was, but my question got answered.
Perfect. All right. Let me look. I don't see any other hands up at all. And anybody can double check me there, but I don't see anything. So, all right. Well, thanks for the public comment and thanks, members. So, I think, Ryan, we probably need to kind of summarize what we're going to go through here.
If you'd like me to, I've been taking some notes here. I can certainly rattle off at least the pertinent points, or the ones that I think that we settled on that were at the very least still going to be live topics for the subcommittee's conversation, and we'll go from there. So
perfect. If you would just hold on a second, I want to comment on the former Senator Story brought up nonprofits. That's on the list of the Local Fairness and Equity Subcommittee. So they're working on that. And then Commissioner Oakler's the 95 mills topic is on the Education Subcommittee. So they're looking at those two issues. So go ahead, Ryan.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And so these might be a combination of either data requests that we'll bring back to you, or, you know, specific hard, solid topic items that you guys might be tackling. The first one, better understanding of non-levy revenues by county. I think that's something we can probably pull together at the state level, report back. You know, certainly if anything comes of that, that's great. But just to get an idea of who's getting what, I think we can get you that. Definitely just let's keep talking about the dates of local elections. That's going to be picked up in some places too, but, you know, is there anything you can do there? I think the big nexus that we got, and a lot of these are kind of together, is the whole 1510-420 Senate Bill 511. How do special assessments fit into that or not? How do TIF districts fit into that or not? How does bonding limitations? That's one that, you know, we can definitely try to write up a little bit clearer, but I think those are largely the topics that we were talking about there, including, you know, understanding better what are the current local debt limits and is there any discretion there? Aside from that, I think we are going to continue looking at some of the public assistance programs, or the taxpayer assistance programs, I should say. We do have some model capabilities, so if we want to look at some specific examples, we can do that, but we'll keep that on there. Did hear the local option tax. I know that is going to be looked at more specifically from the Tax Fairness Committee, although it will have an impact on here. So we'll kind of keep it on that soft second tier list that, you know, will impact our discussions. We can likely bring back some of the Commissioner Galt brought up the Prop 13. There was a citizens initiative and at least one or two, maybe in the last couple of go arounds. We probably have some numbers that we could bring back on that topic too, just to see what at least the state and local impacts were estimated to be when that proposal was made. Kind of the continuing conversation about smoothing assessments. That's also going to be in tax fairness, but, you know, ultimately it has an impact for us as well. What else am I missing, Mr. Chairman? Or
I think as Mr. Story brought up permissive levies, I think we probably need to summarize those. I think Legislative Service Division, Megan Moore probably already got a great chart on that, so it won't be that difficult, but we can look at those.
Sure thing.
On the PTAP type programs, we need to make sure we look at the means testing and income limits and all that stuff that's going on there too. And on the non-levy revenue, make sure, I don't know how much you can capture what the local govs are getting. Do you have any idea of the reporting on that? Is it all getting reported to the state level, or are we missing some information, or do we know?
I don't know the answer to that. Perhaps Department of Revenue does, and if they don't, we can bring that back with the data.
Yeah, so in terms of oil and gas, the Department of Revenue is the collector of that tax, and then we distribute to the counties. I don't know if we'll have great data on how the counties split up that money after we send it to them. Because it works kind of similar to the entitlement share, where the state gets sends a pot of money to the treasurer, and then it's the treasurer's responsibility to divvy that up to the various taxing jurisdictions in the proportion, in certain proportions. And then for coal gross proceeds, that is actually collected by the county and then remitted to the state. We have good data on what's supposed to be collected, but there's been some problems in recent years down in Bighorn County with actually collecting the taxes that are owed. So I think we'll have good data on what should be happening, but maybe not necessarily the best data on the actual flow of the money.
Okay. From my standpoint, I think that covers. Any other committee members, anything we missed or we want to add in here as we move forward? Sandra?
Yeah, Commissioner Logan brought up for the special improvement districts, and I put it in the chat that maybe we should have it defaulted that property owners have to be defaulted into not accepting the SID instead of defaulting into accepting it.
Okay, I think under the item 3 that Ryan had discussed, 1510 and 420 had special districts in there. I think we do need some education on special districts as to, how those are being used, what we can do to improve them. So
thanks.
All right.
And Mr. Chairman, maybe just a couple before we go here, before you choose to adjourn, unless you have something else. I guess just moving forward again, thanks for all your participation today. This is, a big time commitment. We anticipate, as we discussed, having the next meeting of the whole March 18th. I would anticipate an agenda coming out from Director Osmondson likely next week. And like we discussed with the other subcommittees, I think, there's no absolute directive. It's the thoughts that there will probably be a subcommittee report back to the full committee. Some discussion will likely have some agenda items, and but we'll get a full agenda out there. But yeah, any other questions, please reach out.
Okay. Senator McGilvery, do you have so you got your hand up there?
Yeah, I just had one more question. It's regarding the property tax bill. I know you carried this bill, I think, Senator Hertz. When Sandra said that her property tax bill, and I looked at it when she put it online, that shows that certain mills are voted. Billy's property tax bills do not show if they're voted or not. Can you tell me, is it state law that they're showed to be voted on that property tax bill, or is that just to the discretion of the city?
I believe that's to the discretion of the local government and some of the software that they're using. I know the revenue interim committees were discussing that particular issue. I'm not 100% sure about the requirement, but we've talked about getting tax bills more similar across the state. And I've worked with the treasurers about it recently too. There are 2 software vendors who actually provide the software to the different counties. And we could require at a state level, here's the minimum that as a vendor you need to meet. And then push that out there. Both vendors are doing a pretty good job, but I don't know if that answers your question, Senator McGilvery, but the Revenue Committee is looking at that.
All right, thanks.
All right, so as we move forward here, I'll work with Ryan here over the next few days, weeks, and we'll kind of summarize what we covered here and then push that probably back out to our subcommittee members to kind of make sure, hey, did we get everything that we talked about here, so that when we have the full committee on March 18th, we're giving a good report about what we discussed and also help us moving forward. And as we move forward too, I'll work with Ryan and in fleshing out some of this, getting more information, more presentations, more data. And if any of you committee members have any suggestions, feel free to reach out to me. Best way is probably an email. Shoot me an email with your thoughts on something we want to continue to go forward with. So with that, seeing no further hands raised or anything else, the meeting is hereby adjourned. So thank you, everybody.
You.